Hello and welcome. I would like to provide a solution for the tic-tac-toe challenge. Now remember, there's many solutions to a given problem. This is just going to be my solution. If your solution is different, as long as you follow good programming practice and you use the C programming language the correct way, then that's fine. I'm just providing my solution. I'm sure it can be improved. So let's get started. I'm going to create a new project. It's called tic-tac-toe, obviously. And we're going to start trying to modulize it. I tried breaking it down like I did in the description of the lecture. I'm going to create only a few modules, or I should say a few functions. Hopefully this will be okay and work good for you. Say tic-tac-toe. And you see I'm using camel case for all my naming conventions, just what I'm used to. We could actually even separate this into multiple source files as well if we wanted. So we have our main. Let's get rid of this printf. I am going to include an additional include. This will allow me to basically do some clearing of our system and a couple nice things. Allow me also to, I think, remove a char. So in addition to these two libraries, let's include conio.h. And what I want to do, and I want to attack this problem, I want to try to module as much as I can. I mentioned that I'm going to use a single dimensional array. A two-dimensional array might even work better. But I'm going to implement this using a single dimensional array that represents our game board, our tic-tac-toe board. I'm going to create this as a global variable. I'm using a global variable here because I haven't demonstrated the concept of passing data by reference in C. I don't want to confuse you. I would not have to use global data here, and I could pass the data to functions, but I would need to use pass by reference. I would have to pass around pointers. And we haven't discussed any of that yet. So I'm going to use global data. Forgive me. Remember, I said global data is usually not a good thing to do. But because, again, we're trying to demonstrate learning, divide and conquer, and we're trying to demonstrate how to utilize functions, I need to use global data because we haven't talked about pointers yet. So my global data here that I'm going to use is my square that represents my grid, my tic-tac-toe board. This is going to be a single dimensional array of 10 elements, mainly because I don't want to use the 0 element. I'm going to use this array to pick numbers to play the game. It's going to also allow for me to have my coordinates. I'm going to initialize this with just values 1 through 9. And this is going to be a character array because I need to put X's and O's in it. All right, we haven't talked about character arrays yet, but this will allow me to put single characters. It's just like the array concept of ints, except it contains characters. Characters, remember, have single quotes around them. So 1, 2, 3 to 9, the 0 there, the O, I'm just going to skip. I'm not even going to use, but because I want to use the ones to. It makes programming a bit easier. I can use the value that the user enters as an index, as a valid index. I'm also going to have to create two global variables for choice in the player turn. So choice is going to be what they entered via the keyboard, either a 1 through 9, depending on where they want to place their X or O. Player is going to just represent whose player's turn it is, player 1 or player 2. I don't need any other global data. I just need my function declarations here. I'm going to start off with creating 3 functions. So I'm going to have 3 function declarations. I'm going to have one for checking for a win. It's not going to take any data. It's going to return an int. I'm going to have one that doesn't return any data, that just displays the board with the correct characters. It also doesn't take any data. And I'm also going to have a function that just marks the board. This will take the user input, and depending on what they entered, it will place an X or an O in the correct spot in the array, and then display that array using display board. So here we're just going to say mark board, and that's going to actually take a mark with an X or an O. So I can reuse this. I can reuse this for player 1 or player 2. 3 function declarations so that I can place my functions anywhere in the program. I've declared them up top. And you'll notice that 2 of these functions aren't returning any data, and only one is taking a parameter. Now we can actually start invoking or creating these. Let's implement these functions before we implement the gameplay. So first let's implement check for win. This function is basically going to work where it's going to check the board to see if there's any wins. So it's going to contain a lot of if statements. I could probably improve this code quite a bit. But I'm going to put some comments in here because we should always have comments at the top of our function. These are pretty simplified. We should have the function name. This is basically saying that the function is going to return a game status of 1 if the game is over, tell you if you won, a result of -1 if the game is in progress, and 0 if the game is over and was a draw. That's why, so this function, check for win, is returning an int. So I'm going to go ahead and define this, and all this is going to do is it's going to look at the array and see if there's any spots in there. If 3 x's match. So there's a lot of different if statements. So how do we know if a player has won? Well, we know if a player has won if they either match in a row, diagonal, or a column. So we have to check each one of those situations. And we know the rows and the columns based on the array. So if my square 1 is equal to square 2 and square 2 is equal to square 3, that means we have a match in our first row, right? So I'm also going to create a return value here. At the top, I'm just going to say return value. Initialize this to 0. Actually, we'll initialize this to 0 for game over. And if we have a match in the first row, I'm going to return 1. Game's over. We then have to have a series of other else ifs to match. And actually, I don't want to return 1. I want to set my return value. Because it's, we could return, but it makes the program harder to follow. Otherwise, we're going to check all of our other rows. So I'm going to copy and paste some code in here because it's a lot of redundant code. The only thing that's interesting is if we have a draw. So let me put in all the else ifs for winners. All right. And then I'm also going to return different values. And I could actually have, instead of having a bunch of else ifs, I could have ampersands, but that's even harder to read. So if we have a match in the first row, and let's make sure our indentation is correct. If we have a match in our second row, that's what the second one's doing. If we have a match in our third row, return 1, add some new lines for readability. Don't need any brackets because they're single statements. On line 37, it looks like we're matching 1, 4, and 7, so this looks like a diagonal match. Return 1. 40, we're matching 2, 5, and 8. That looks like a match of the center going down, so the second column. 3, 6, you can see the other matches as well. We have to basically catch all matches for rows, columns, and diagonals. And that's what we've done with all these statements, looking in the array. Now, the one thing that tells us if we don't have a match or we have a draw is we have to compare all of them and basically just make sure they're not the numbers that were initialized. So if we have our array square and it doesn't contain 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, or 9 for any of the values, that means we have a draw because they contain a 0 or an x. So we can write another else if that basically says it's a draw, and we can set the return value to 0. Return value equal to 0. And again, this is just basically checking this last else if the numbers are the same as they were initialized. If they're all different, then that means we can return 0. Let's put that up 1. Otherwise, if we don't have a draw and we don't have a winner, that means we're not done. So a final else statement can just say return value equals a -1. Because remember, the function is returning -1 for game in progress, 1 for game is over, and 0 for game with no result. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to return the return value. So here I'm just going to say return value. And this will complete the function. And what do you notice when we're doing this? We're dividing and conquering. All we're focusing on right now is checking the board to see if there's a win. We would work in small chunks, just like this, and we would constantly test. This allows us to focus on our design and also allows us to reduce or isolate our errors easier. Now that we're done with the game board, we want to go ahead and implement the display board. The display board is just going to show the board. So all this really needs to do is draw the array in a specific format, right? So we're going to write a function called display board It's not going to return any data. It's not going to take any parameters. The reason it's a function, number one, is because we're going to need to draw the board many times. And also, it's just better because it's doing a specific task. Now this one is just going to have a bunch of printf functions in it. And it's going to have a bunch of formatting. So I'm going to copy and paste it in. The thing that's unique here is I'm clearing the screen each time. In that con.io, actually I don't think it's in the con.io, I think it's in another include. But if you say system and Windows and you say CLS, that's going to clear the screen. That just makes it cleaner. We're then going to just do a bunch of printfs. We're going to print out the title of the game. We're going to print out the player, 1 and 0. And then we're going to print out the board. The board is going to be nicely formatted with some parallel bars. And then we're going to print out the values of all the values in the array. And if the value is X or 0, it's going to display. If it's not, it's going to display a number so we can use that number to select our option to draw. And that's it. That's it. That's all this function does. Now that we're done with displaying the board, we now want to create our last function, which is marking the board. Right? So mark board is going to set the array with a particular value. And it's going to take a mark in either an X or an O. So it's going to take a character. What this is going to do is it's going to have a bunch of other else if statements. Right? So here in our mark board, we're going to want to basically give some comments and say that this is going to set the board with the correct character. X or O in the correct spot in the array. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. As you see the code, I got to end my comment. I want to format it nice, so it's 2 lines here. And all this is going to do is it's going to check to see what the user entered. So remember, we have 2 global data values for what the user entered. We also have a value for the current player. So choice is going to be basically what is entered via the keyboard. We haven't implemented this yet because we're going to implement that in the main function. Player is going to be the current player. We're going to need both of these to make our marks. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a bunch of else statements, if-else statements. We're going to check the choice, which is what's input by the user. And if the choice is equal to 1, we want to draw something in that square. We also want to make sure that that square is available. So if it's equal to 1 and it's not currently equal to 1, that means that basically somebody already put an X or an O there and we can't use it. If it's equal to a 1 and they entered 1, that means we can set the array to a specific value. We're going to set the array to what was passed in, either the O or the X. And we're going to repeat to do this for each choice, if its choice is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, or 9. Right? So a bunch of else ifs that do the same thing. If the user entered choice 2, we're going to make sure the indentation's good, and square 2 is available, we're going to mark square 2 with whatever we passed in here. And depending on what player's turn it is, we're going to pass in an O or an X. Now, the last thing we need to do in this function is we have to validate. If they passed in anything other than 1 through 9, then that's an invalid move. So our last else statement should basically last else statement here will print out a message saying invalid move. It will mark the player down 1 because remember, players are either 1 or 2. And we're going to mark the player back, and then we're going to increment it in our loop in our main function. And then this last thing, getchar, is just pausing the program so that the user has to hit return after invalid move. Otherwise, invalid move would be displayed, and then it would immediately be erased because we'd redraw the board again. So getchar pauses it. It forces you to hit the enter button to go on to enter another value. And these are our 3 functions. Remember, this function doesn't return anything, so we can keep it at the bottom. Now we have to actually implement the gameplay. The gameplay goes in the main function, which is, where? I got to find it. There it is. It's empty. And so for the gameplay, this is where we're going to ask the user to enter a number. We're going to draw the board. We're going to check for win. So we're going to create 2 local variables here, and we're going to initialize our player. Here we're going to create our integer I. This is going to be used for our loop. And our mark is going to be either X or O, depending on whose turn it is. Yeah, Mark is going to be X or O, I believe. I'm trying to remember if Mark is... No, yeah, Mark is going to be X or O. And choice is going to be what the user enters via the keyboard. So 2 local variables. We're also going to set our player, which is a global variable. Initially, it's just going to be player 1 to start the game. Then we're going to have a loop. We're going to have basically a loop until we're done playing. I'm going to use a do while loop here because I want it to execute at least once. I want to display the board at least once. So I'm going to display the board and play the game until I get a draw, basically, or a win. So I'm going to do it as long as I is equal to a -1. What does a -1 represent? It represents the game is in progress. I is going to be the return value for checking for win. And you'll see that in a second. But basically, we're going to have a loop that keeps doing the same thing over and over until the game is over. And the game is going to be over if it's not a -1. So what do we have to do first? First thing we have to do is we have to display the board. So I can just call the function display board. Then we have to calculate the player. And the player starts off player 1. What we're going to do here is we're going to use a ternary operator. And we're going to say if the player mod 2, then the player equals 1, else it equals 2. This is a way to determine the right player. Each iteration of the loop, it's going to change from 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. When it starts out as player 1, it's going to say player mod 2, I'm misspelling there, 1 divided by 2, or the remainder of 1 divided by 2 is what? 1. So if it's 1, you're going to be player 1. And then when you go back for the next iteration, player is going to be equal to 2, because we're going to increment it. 2 mod 2 is 0. So if it's not equal to 1, then player is going to be equal to player 2. It's only going to set it to player 1 if player mod 2 is 1. Remember that ternary operator, hopefully. The next thing I need to do is I need to get the input from the user. So here I'm going to say, I'm going to ask the user to input a number. I'm going to say player %d, either player 1 or 2, enter a number. And then I'm going to put the player to print out, player 1 or 2. Then I'm going to read the input from the user using scanf. And that's going to be an integer. That's going to represent a spot on the board, 1 through 9. And I'm going to store that in my choice variable. Choice is an int, so I have to pass in the address. And I have to say choice. Only if it's a string, I would not pass in the address. Then I can basically determine whether or not what the mark is. I have to determine if the mark is an X or an O based on the player. So I'm going to use the ternary operator again. And I'm going to assign to mark either an X or O. If the player is equal to 1, I'm going to assign to mark the X, capital X. Otherwise, I'm going to assign it an O, capital O. So this ternary operator is very useful when you have to assign variables based on a condition. Again, what this is saying is if the player is equal to 1, mark is going to be equal to X. Else, it's going to be equal to O. The question mark represents if the Boolean evaluation is true. The colon represents if it's false. Now that I got the correct letter, I can call my function for marking the board by just saying mark board and passing in the X or the O. After I mark the board and they made their selection, I have to check if there's a winner. I have my variable I, which really probably should be a better name. Let's name it status check. Game check, how about that? Or game status. Game status. And game status is going to be equal to a 1, a -1, or a 0. Game status is going to be equal to whatever is returned from check for win. Because remember, this function will return a 1, a 0, or a -1. A 1 if you win. Well, actually, let me remember. Check for win returns a 1 if the game is over with a result. -1 if the game is in progress. 0 if it's over with no result. So now that we stored game status, we'll also want to change the exit condition of the loop. So if the game status is equal to -1, we'll jump out of the loop. Otherwise, all we need to do is change the player's turn. How do we change the player's turn? We just increment the player by 1. That way, the next time it will go up and it will be 2, and player will be equal to 2, and we'll go back down. When they make invalid attempts, what happens in the invalid attempt is it decrements the player count. When you decrement the player count, you go back to the correct player. So if it's 1, you decrement it to 0. the next turn is going to be 1. It's essentially your same turn again. That's why we increment it. Now, if it's player 2, we increment it by 1. And what happens is 2 divided by 2 is 0, so it actually sets the player back to 1. That's how that works. But this is all the logic. We did a lot here. You should not write all this code and test at once. You should have been working with the divide and conquer, constantly testing as you're running the code. Now, I'm going to provide this solution, but let's run it and test it. It's going to work just like it did in the demo from the challenge lecture. But again, study this code and make sure you understand what's going on. The use of arrays and the divide and conquer approach. But look how nice this main method looks. It's very easy to know what's going on in the main method. Display board, change player, and you probably want to put in comments here. Change turns. And then also here, get input, right? And then set the correct letter. Set the correct character based on player turn. And you don't even really need these comments because the functions are so descriptive. Mark board. Set the board based on the user choice. Based on user choice. Or invalid choice. And then the game status, check for win. Pretty self-explanatory. And then we jump out if the game is over. Let's build this. Hopefully get no errors, no warnings. We don't, which is nice. Now let's run it, and you're going to see it works just like in our demo. First thing it does is it's going to display the screen, and it's going to allow us to put in an enter. And it has our grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, our array. So it tells me player 1 to enter something, and I'm going to enter something valid, and it draws it. And it clears the screen. So it looks like nice. And now there's an X in 3. Now it's player 2's turn. Let's do something invalid. It says invalid moves. It pauses. I hit return. I get to go again, player 2. Now I hit 1, redraws with the O in the 1 spot. And I continue this until we have a winner or a loser. So let's cause a winner for O. So now X is going to be 2. O is going to be 5. X is going to be 6. And O is going to be 9. Game over. Because we just drew 3 O's. Actually, I forgot one thing. It doesn't tell you if you won. So the one thing I forgot was after the while loop to display a congratulations, you won. And all we have to do there is we have to check the game status. If the game status is equal to 1, that means a player won, and it would be the last player that wins. So we would print out player %D wins. Otherwise, we're going to just print out a draw. Because if we got out of our loop and the status was a -1, we know the game was over and had a result. It just might. So we have to have that last if statement to display the results. So now let's run it again as a winner. And now we'll actually see somebody win. So I'm just going to put in valid numbers here. Cause a quick win for X. And actually I have to do it in this program because that one goes away. There it goes. Player 1 wins, and it played in a little nice sound there. So this was a long lecture. I apologize for the long lecture. Study this code. I'll provide it as a source file. Hopefully you learned a lot about methods in divide and conquer. Thank you.